Welcome to the Electric Wire podcast. We bring you news and views on the most pressing issues facing Wisconsin's electric industry, from policymakers, executives, and customer and environmental advocates. Bringing you these discussions, we are the Customers First Coalition. Here's your host, Executive Director Kristen Jilks.
Today, we are joined by Gary Meltz and Brad Viator from the Power for Tomorrow organization, which is a national group serving as a resource to help policymakers and the public understand how the regulated electric utility model protects customers and supports environmental and public policy goals. This is a mission similar to that of the Customers First Coalition here in Wisconsin, and it was helpful to learn more about Power for Tomorrow's efforts on a national scale. Thanks again for listening, and I'll turn you over to my interview with Gary Meltz and Brad Viator from Power for Tomorrow now. Welcome to the Electric Wire, Brad and Gary. Thank you so much. We're excited to learn more about Power for Tomorrow. And Gary, you are Executive Director of Power for Tomorrow. So tell us more about the organization and your role there.
Well, Power for Tomorrow was created for a couple of different reasons. And I'll say, before it was created, it was an idea. And Brad and I had worked together and we worked, on electric utilities and issues around electric utilities. And every few years or every few months, a deregulation fight would come up. And we'd look into what the other side was proposing. And we just couldn't believe that this was going on, and that the government was endorsing a policy that saddled ratepayers with a plan that charges them more, almost 100% of the time eventually, for electricity than if they just stuck with the incumbent regulated utility. And it was literally like, we dive into it, we write op-eds, we do white papers, and you couldn't believe this was going on. And we couldn't believe the other people on the side of the debate were defending this. And what we had ultimately, realized was it was consistently the people least able to afford higher electric bills were paying higher electric bills under deregulation. And we thought something needed to be done. And this was an idea that we said, we need to start a group or something. And then Winter Storm Uri came. And what happened in Texas, which was a deregulated system, failed and left millions of people without electricity for days, causing billions of dollars in economic damage. And more importantly, had killed hundreds of people. A lot of people lost their lives because they didn't have electricity because the system failed. And it was sort of everything in addition to the consumer side of paying more for electricity, the failures of a deregulated market. It was sort of everything we were saying as well were proven true. And out of that, Power for Tomorrow sprung. And, our first sort of foray into this was in Virginia. And then, I'll let Brad talk about a little bit what happened in Virginia and what we did, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Gary. Kristen, if that's cool, I'll pick up. Brad Viator. I'm one of Gary's board members at Power for Tomorrow and kind of work more on some of the policy issues. So we launched the group in Virginia because they were having a discussion about deregulation. And
I remember that. This is 2021 time
2021. Yeah, 2021. They're having a discussion, and then Winter Storm Uri happens on February 15th. Hundreds of people die, all this damage out there. And we're like, let's go. Let's just tell the story about the Texas dumpster fire in this place that is literally like the lobbyists from the IPPs the week before were saying, bring Texas-style deregulation to Virginia. And we're like, all right, well, this is our chance. Let's really jump into this fight and tell the story about why it's so broken and why it's so wrong. So we did that in 2021. We did a couple of sort of studies about like why the cost of electricity is higher in the deregulated marketplaces. And we've really just kind of focused attention telling this story in two different places, in There are a couple of states right now, and really over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, that have considered deregulation. So we tell the story in those states. Hey, here's what you're giving up. These are the costs that you're going to be looking at. We kind of jump into those marketplaces and tell that and focus on establishing credibility there. And then we work with the other states that are presently deregulated and are considering re-regulating. Fantastic example of this was Senate Bill 1, which passed in Maryland last year, which eliminated, for all intents and purposes, retail competition. And that was driven by consumer advocates that are allies of ours. And they were like, look, this thing sucks and it costs people a whole heck of a lot of money. And, poor people are the ones that are bearing the brunt of it. So that bill's there. And then there's been a bill in Massachusetts that was championed by the governor back when she was attorney general that does kind of the same thing and eliminates it. So we've been working on that, paying attention in Pennsylvania where they're trying to bring in re-regulation. So we're just kind of doing a little bit of whack-a-mole and trying to get as much information out as possible
And
to share
and
these.
yeah, and I think what's sort of really cool about what we're doing is that when people get the full story, they realize almost 100% of the time we're right, unless they're paid by the other side. And I think what happened in Maryland with SB1 was so instructive because all SB1 did was say that the retail suppliers could not charge more than the regulated utility, and when that happened, they all left. So if they're going to say in Virginia or Louisiana or any other state that, hey, if you allow retail supply in, we can save people money, and then it's like, well, then how come when Maryland said you can't charge more than the regulated utility, you all, were out of there to New York second? You know what I mean? So I think, that was really instructive, and I think SB1 should be something that, as Brad mentioned, states that have deregulation, SB1 should be something that they're looking at and strongly considering.
I think that's really important. And thank you for bringing up that example of Maryland. We've actually had Laurel Peltier on the podcast
Yeah. Oh,
before, and
nice.
she's
Yeah.
she's been to Madison for one of our Power Breakfast events. As I look up information on SB1 online and stuff too, it is incredible that sometimes the other side will say they eliminated choice in Maryland and now costs are going up, and it's like, well, that's not true. You know what I mean? You could have still stayed, but you're not able to
Yeah, it's a straw
have
man
a
argument they're
profitable
setting up. Yeah.
business if you're not actually charging more than the local utility. So thank you. Thank you. I think that's one of the most powerful examples as I go around the Capitol in Madison as well, to hear that story and hear that the consumer protection issues are so grave that they needed to reverse course. So let's go back to the beginning. I first asked you guys to come on the podcast and talk more about Power for Tomorrow when I read your recent column that was in Real Clear Energy, Gary. The column was titled "Electric Deregulation Historically Means Higher Power Bills." And I just want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about that column, why you wrote it now, and sort of defend that claim that deregulation means higher power bills.
Well, I wrote it because other states are considering bringing deregulation in and they're considering allowing retail suppliers to compete with the regulated utility. And the reason I put that title on that op-ed and what I've consistently found is that when you try and argue with the retail supply industry, and you're pushing your fact sheets across the table and they're pushing their fact sheets across the table, you're playing into their hands, because what they want to do is have a complicated discussion about all the faults of a regulated utility. And of course, Brad and I support the regulated utility model, but we're not going to say it's perfect and the world's greatest thing and that there's no room for improvement. There's always room for improvement. But when it comes down to it, what I have found is that when you say, hey, this is going to mean higher electric bills, pretty much every decision maker, whether it's a regulator or a lawmaker who is on the fence, will say to themselves, Brad and I have worked for a lot of elected officials over the years, and we've worked in politics, and you put yourself into that mind of the decision maker, and you say, well, do I want to get blamed for higher electric bills? And that's what this group is saying, that if I vote this way, if I support this public policy, it's going to mean my constituents, my voters, the people I'm elected to represent, they're going to be paying a higher electric bills. Well, they're not going to respond kindly to that. And that could cost me my job. So, uh, for a lack of a better or a more complex rationale, that's it. But it's just pretty straightforward. Is that we think when you tell people it means higher electric bills, we win, and it does. So
Yeah. Many years and many states to look at to see the evidence that regulated states have consistently lower bills overall than the deregulated states average.
Mhm.
Brad, did you have anything you wanted to add there
Yeah,
about the column? Or?
yeah, I want to actually pull on that thread, Kristen, about the sort of, where does the data come from? Why do we say this? Like, what is this based on? And I was thinking about that a little bit today. The study that we cite, part of what Gary was saying about when we launched in the wake of Winter Storm Uri, the first study we always cite is what the Wall Street Journal said immediately in the wake of Winter Storm Uri, and it said for the period of deregulation, 2004 to 2019, customers that shopped, and in Texas there's a weird nuance. Everybody has to shop, but there are two regulated parts of the state. So Entergy in the east, El Paso Electric in the west, um, and Excel are both regulated. So you have within one state, you're able to make a comparison between deregulated and regulated. And what they decided, or what they learned, is that customers spent $28 billion more in the deregulated portion of the state. And this is the same story that you hear in other jurisdictions. The National Consumers Law Center has a pretty fantastic sort of cataloging of costs across states. And they look at Connecticut, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, and New York, sort of these more progressive states. And they're over varying time periods, but they just list the numbers of overpayment. In Connecticut, from 2015 to 2022, it's $299 million in overpayment. In Illinois, it's 388 million, almost 389 million from June 2020 to May of 2021. Maine, 78 million, Maryland, 35 million for just 2017, 1.2 billion for a 2-year period in New York. Like, there's just unbelievable costs that are associated with it. And then, the other state that I think you've got to pay attention to when you're in this discussion that has good economic growth and is deregulated is Ohio. And there was a study that Ohio State put out last year in 2024 that essentially says 72% of customers that shop for electricity pay more. And it's just like fact after fact, data point after data point seems to prove the point. And I think where Gary and I sit, we kind of are focused on all customers, but I know for me, the only thing I really care about is residential customers. And when you see these exorbitant costs being borne by people that just don't have flexibility in their budgets, just to benefit some, wealthy company that wants to do a data center or manufacturing facility, it's not cool. And that's sort of the story that we see all over the country when you've deregulated.
So as you're talking about that, I think it lends itself to another question. Is just like, why do you think that regulation works better?
Planning. I mean, the real simple reason and simple answer is because of planning. You're able to go through an integrated resource planning process where you say, hey, here are the resources that I think I'm going to need. You litigate that at the Public Service Commission with all the stakeholders, everybody weighs in. Public Service Commission goes, all right, that's cool. And then you come back in with a rate case where you're executing against that integrated resource plan and you build the resources that you expect you're going to need. In a deregulated market, the idea is that market signals are going to tell us what we need and when we need it. But really, what it does is it forces us to live on the edge of scarcity. And the moment that we're in right now, after 20, 30 years of flat demand, to now all of a sudden seeing an increase, and there's no available supply in these markets, prices are shooting through the roof. Price of capacity has gone up 1,100% in Maryland in 2 years. This is wild. You can't get out of that with these economic signals. You need to force people to build things, and regulated markets allow you to do that.
And I'll just to come on top, just to sort of reiterate what Brad said, is that I think what I like to say is the deregulated markets, they reward scarcity. So it's not there's scarcity by design, right? That every state doesn't need to have an oversupply. So and you have that component, and then you have the other aspect of if you're an independent power producer in a deregulated state, you make money when there's scarcity. And if you take that profit and invest it in building another plant, you're competing with yourself. You're devaluing your assets. It's like, why did all the Subway restaurants suddenly go out of business? Well, because there was like 10 in every block. You know what I mean? So it was like they were competing with themselves and cannibalizing. And they realized, hey, if there's not enough Subways, there'll be a line at the Subway. And it's the same thing. And then I think what we've also seen in the deregulated markets versus the regulated is that you could say the deregulated market works better 363 days a year. But those 2 days where it doesn't work and there's shortages, all the savings get blown out of the water, and it's a disaster for those 2 days. And you're like, oh, well, yeah, there's that. It's not working now. There's power shortages, blackouts, price spikes. And so it's in its totality, it's just when you put them head to head, I just don't see how anybody could rationally say, hey, let's go the deregulated route.
That's fair. Yes. In addition to customers paying higher costs, the reliability issue is huge and one of the main benefits of regulation from where we see it. Brad, at one point you had mentioned, residential customers benefit the most. I know from reading the column, it sounds like Louisiana is considering partially deregulating for larger customers. What issues arise when partial deregulation is considered?
So the issue is like residential customers still lose because what are you doing? You're eliminating people from the system. You're eliminating people from paying bills to maintain the system. So you're going to end up with stranded costs, which have to be socialized across the remaining customer base, right? And in so doing, that means residential customers are going to have to pay, even if they figure out this cost allocation. The best example of all this is really in Nevada, when they tried to restructure, and then there was a ballot measure that kind of killed it. What they ended up doing is they let a bunch of the large casinos leave, and all these casinos had to pay these big exit fees, right? Like 50, 80, 100 million bucks to leave the system to ensure that the costs were sort of like held harmless. But what they're learning years on is that that wasn't sufficient. Like when you lose a big customer, just you've got to socialize the costs of the system across a fewer universe, right? Like you're reducing the size of the denominator, and it has pretty significant impact on customers in really all instances. And so it's bad. It's a bad deal. AARP in Louisiana wrote a letter and filed with the commission on this very point. They said that industrial choice is the worst possible option because there's absolutely no benefit and no upside and only cost borne by residential customers.
And I think in Louisiana, you have industrial customers make up what's percentage of the
More than
electricity?
50%. It's one of the
More
few.
than 50%.
Actually, the analog to for kind of the Midwest to think about is Elite. Elite has like a similar service area where something like 60-70% of their customers are industrial. When one of those customers leaves, it's cataclysmic, right? And in a state like Louisiana, if you have the folks that are representing more than 50% of the rate base walking away, the costs are through the roof.
We talked a little bit about cost increases right now. We hear a lot about that, and it's it's one of the harder issues to try to tackle. But what I want to start with is, in terms of cost increases, is that happening across the board, or is it happening more in deregulated or regulated states? What's driving some of the cost increases in the cost of electricity right now?
So it varies, but I'll kind of go into a little bit of detail to answer it. So it varies from state to state, and we are seeing cost increases across the board. Cost increases in regulated states are driven by increases in equipment, increases in labor. When you're having to sort of make investments in the system, you're socializing those costs across customers, right? Like that is just a thing that happens. But like you divide in a cost of service model whatever these assets cost among your customers. And so it's sort of shared in an equitable way. In the deregulated marketplaces, they're not like you're still making investments in the distribution assets and you're still making investments in the transmission assets, which everybody's paying for. But the price of the energy itself and the price of capacity is shooting through the roof because of scarcity. They're not going in and building new natural gas plants that are going to help and solve this problem. So what you're having is people are paying more money for fewer electrons, and that price is going up. So we're seeing big spreads there. The real control you get with the sort of regulated model is that the regulators themselves have to ensure that the costs are allocated. Like if Google comes to town and is like, yeah, I want all my power for free, and the price of residential electricity goes up, those regulators are going to have to be the ones that pay the price. So what they do is and this has kind of been the new novel trend, you're creating these customer classes and these rate classes for large customers like data centers so that all the costs to that group of customers are contained within that universe. That is a feature of regulation. That's not a feature that exists in these deregulated marketplaces because you could allocate the costs of transmission or you could allocate the cost of distribution, but you're not going to be able to allocate those costs of generation. It's just going to be borne on everybody. And I think that's one of the big areas of differentiation.
And I think, one of our first early successes was, when the war broke out in Ukraine and Russia, where natural gas prices surged. And Brad and I put together a study, the Wall Street Journal covered it, and basically said, okay, if you live in a deregulated state, here's natural gas prices and here's your electric bill. And then what we saw was the regulated states, the regulators protected the customers from those spikes. So, I think that's, worth mentioning.
I've often heard the regulated utility model described as almost like an insurance policy,
Yeah.
where you may see increases, but it's going to be slower and steady over time, versus these large spikes. I think it's a good model that insulates customers from some of those risks. We mentioned data centers, and of course, I'll have to say to my good friends at Google, they have never been asking for free electricity.
Yeah,
And
sorry.
a former board member of mine, a good friend, Tyler Huebner, is at Google now for the Central States. And so also a podcast listener. So shout out, Tyler, if you're listening. But so we know they are committed to paying their fair share, but there's, still cost pressures when demand is increasing. And so, Gary, your column touched on this a little bit, and you sort of led off with a mention of data centers up front. Can you tell us a little bit more about how data centers are impacting the energy landscape and what that means for regulation or deregulation?
Well, it depends where you live, right? So what Brad and I like to talk about is if you're, let's compare PJM with Georgia. And where in PJM, you have all these data centers, there's all this demand, the auctions are going through the roof. And, the problem isn't the data centers, in my view. The problem is that the grid manager cannot bring on new power. And that's the fundamental job of the grid managers, to bring on new power and accept new customers. I mean, if they can't do that, why are you there, right? I mean, that's your job. And then what we've seen in Georgia is that the advent of data centers in Georgia has actually stabilized electricity prices. Georgia Power and regulators have approved a 3-year rate freeze. because all these data centers are offering, economic investment in the state and providing capital to Georgia Power, allowing them to stabilize rates for all the residential customers. And Brad, like that Power for Tomorrow, that's our real focus is the residential customers. And I think you can just draw those two easy comparisons between Georgia and PJM and see, you know, what the benefits of planning and regulation and creating a price class for a certain customer and ensuring that those data centers pay their fair share, and just having knowing people in the data center industry, what they call it is risk, right? If you go into a state and you're going to jack up rates and everybody and make everybody's life harder, that introduces risk to your deal. And they want to reduce that risk. And I don't think Google or Amazon or anybody, they don't want customers to hate their guts. That's bad for business. So I think it's, we're going to see what's going on in Georgia. I think a lot of lawmakers and regulators and others, with the help of Power Tomorrow, are going to understand what's going on in Georgia and think about how can we, export what the regulated markets are doing to the deregulated markets to protect customers with the advent of all these data centers.
If I can add onto that real quick to go back to math, I've been tutoring my 7th grader in math, so I've been thinking a lot about fractions. What they've done in Georgia, the reason they're able to freeze rates is because we were talking about the problem in Nevada where these large customers left, and the potential problem in Louisiana where large customers left, and reducing the size of the denominator. What they've been doing in Georgia for the last 5 years is increasing the size of the denominator. They've had costs. I don't know if y'all remember, they built 2 big nuclear plants. Those cost a lot of money. They had a bunch of capacity that was out there. But because they've been able to grow their customer base so much, they can continue to make investments in the system and rates don't go up. They're bringing new people to the party. And I think that is the thing that you put at risk. Like, nobody wants to be exposed to PJM. All large customers that are kind of operating in the PJM marketplace are trying to figure out how they're going to get a bilateral contract and get a bunch of deals behind the meter. That was the whole thing that caused a kerfuffle at FERC, where Amazon was trying to sign that Susquehanna nuclear deal behind the meter because they just didn't want to pay the prices that PJM was offering. So instead, they bought all the access to the power plant. And I think that's the sort of thing that's going to happen in these really volatile deregulated markets, whereas in regulated ones, we're going to grow that denominator and we're going to be able to trudge forward and get better equipment and infrastructure for it.
Thank you. That was helpful. What do you think we could be doing to relieve some of the rate pressure in regulated states or deregulated states? It's like no one wants to hear this news of the rate increases or bills going up. So I'm just curious if you guys have seen examples of things that work to try to reduce pressure on rates.
I mean, just said it for Georgia. It's growing the customer base, right? Like, the answer is economic development. The answer is bringing more people to the party and investing in assets smartly. And I think when you are bringing more people to the party, you want to make investments in collective assets. And I think that's the problem in these deregulated marketplaces. Generation just pops up willy-nilly. It doesn't pop up where it's needed. If you're going through a sort of centrally planned process, you can say, all right, cool. I've got 3, 5, 10 new gigawatts of customers, and I can build the resources to support them in locations that make sense. And it's just like you just need more planning. And I think the deregulated markets could do that. They presently don't have the tools. Their governance is a dumpster fire. And so that's not really a solution right in front of them. But we've seen them start to do some of this. Like, PJM went to FERC and said, hey, we want to abandon all of our rules about the queue. And we want to not just accept the 98% of solar and wind that's waiting in line. We actually want to put some priority over 50 gas plants kind of across the region, because if we don't have it, the grid's going to collapse. And FERC was like, okay, fine, this one time you can do it. And then MISO did a similar filing. SPP has done a similar filing. these markets are having to circumvent their own rules to solve the problem. And turns out the answer is the thing we've been doing for 100 years, just doing it the regulated way. You tell somebody where to build something, they build it. They get a reasonable return on investment, not an exorbitant one.
Yeah, I mean, I think over time, our case is going to start making itself more and more because you're going to have these two dichotomies up against each other where you're seeing the regulated markets work and the deregulated markets not work. And, I would point everybody to an op-ed that Brad wrote in RTO Insider. And basically it was saying, hey, the deregulated states need to steal from the regulated states. The concept of this planning and discriminating and picking where to put resources and planning. And ultimately, I think our job's going to get easier in a lot of ways because you're just going to have, as PJM and all these deregulated areas get worse, the regulated states are going to be like, hey, look at us. This is what's going. This is where it's going well. And I think, it's going to, that it's just going to be self-evident.
Thank you. Okay, so we've talked about costs, we've talked about reliability, and we've talked about consumer issues. Is there anything we missed in this discussion that you wanted to cover?
I just have one, and we're channeling a friend of Power for Tomorrow, Bernie McNamee, who says this all the time. And I think a lot of the conservatives who think dereg is stupid, this is the sort of constant refrain that they have, which is it's not deregulation, it's an administrative sort of regulatory process. The PJM tariff is 3,000 pages long. Like, it's not really cutting of red tape. It is moving authorities from your state public service commission to these sort of quasi-governmental bureaucrats that run these RTOs. And that's the fundamental problem is, do you want your government and do you want the control of your power system to be near you, or do you want it to be far afield in Washington and or at the headquarters of the RTOs? And it's really not, it's not deregulation, it's just different regulation.
Fair.
The lack of accountability, I mean, I think that's when there's no accountability and they don't have to answer to anybody, things, the need for more electricity is not something that's completely shocking. I mean, I remember I was at EEI's event in Austin a few years ago, and Elon Musk was up there saying, "We're whatever amount of electricity you think we're going to need, we're going to need twice or three times as much. We're going to need it." And we've all known that this was coming for years. And with a lack of accountability at PGM and these RTOs, they haven't done anything. And that's, that's not free markets. That's just a broken market and nothing that, anybody should be proud of or hail as a way to, to run the country or run our electricity here.
Thank you. Okay, I remembered one other item really quickly. I sent you guys a link to a podcast episode
Sure.
that had caught my attention, and the title of the episode was "Utility Regulation Really Sucks." I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes because I saw the title and I started listening to it and was ready for them to say we need to like dismantle the utility regulatory model, and it wasn't that at all. I mean, they pointed out some of the improvements that could be made to utility regulation, such as like changing some incentives for operations versus capital costs, or changing how loans are financed, things like that. It's a complicated issue, and sometimes it sucks, but I think in the end there's a lot of agreement that utility regulation it fixes more problems than it creates. So with that in mind, I'm curious, are there any um, improvements to the utility regulatory model that either one of you have in mind, or anything that comes to mind that you would suggest?
One of the critiques that I think a lot about is that the advocates for deregulation say that, the deregulated markets create more opportunity for innovation. And I actually agree with them, but I agree with them for a really different reason. It's that thing that I said a moment ago. Nobody wants to be exposed to this sort of insane power prices. So they're figuring out how to do crazy stuff so they don't have to actually purchase power from ERCOT or PJM, right? And so they say that creates an opportunity for innovation. I do think that regulators would be well served to sort of create an opportunity for more sandboxes to try more things. Like there's a lot of discussion right now about utilizing our existing transmission system and kind of getting more out of it, utilizing more of and doing that with maybe with a bunch of different tools, whether they're GETs or how you're going to locate transformers and substations. I think there's a lot of need to do that because we've got so much demand that's coming down the pike. And I think regulators are reticent to let that happen. The other thing that I think they need to be more mindful of, certainly in the wake of the war in Ukraine, is what the utilities are allowed to do when it comes to hedging. I think that we're in a volatile energy environment, much like our political environment and kind of everything else. There's just a lot of volatility out there. And I think that allowing for more of these more utility or for utilities to just have bigger hedges. Maybe they're buying power that's a little bit more expensive right now, but they're buying it for 3 years and it's going to allow for them to get through a trough. I think they'd be wise to consider some of those types of things.
And the last thing I would say about, less of, and Brad mentioned, I'm more the communications guy, less the policy guy, is that I think the electric utilities need to be more assertive in making their cases about, a whole host of issues. Because I think the general public doesn't really understand how the system works. And the utility, and you have that combined with, I think, a lot of the utilities. Like I work for drug companies, electric utilities, and what you end up getting is this: the corporations get this sort of kick dog syndrome, where they're used to just constantly being kicked in the bad guy, and I don't see it that way. And I think that the electric utilities should be much more assertive, explain to customers why their bills, are going up, not hiding, and explaining to people what's really going on here. And, especially for the electric utilities, and why, the regulated model particularly, works the best, and not, you know, uh, be afraid to admit that, that the the lack of competition actually really benefits the customer. And that's, so that's what I would say, is that if anything really needs to change, is that the electric utilities need to be more assertive in defending their business model, because I think it's a good one and a fair one. And like, I listened to that podcast, and sure, it's easy to sit around and say, to criticize any industry or any business, but I think at the end of the day, the regulated utilities are doing a very good job under very difficult circumstances. And and when people, and, say things that aren't true about their business model, they should correct it at every turn, and help educate the public, and help educate lawmakers and regulators. And I think if people really understood what was going on and were educated, we would be all better off, and the retail suppliers of the world would be gone.
The accountability piece to me is important. I feel that the regulated utilities are held accountable by regulators, and customers deserve that. It's easy to criticize when you're not accountable for serving all customers. It's easy to criticize when you're not the one responsible for
Well, yeah.
providing
And
affordable and reliable power at all times.
if you look at what everything you know the retail suppliers are saying, it's always spinning. It's all, it's all misleading. It's all misdirection. You know what I mean? It's all to confuse. And we're always, we're putting out facts, trying to explain these things, and they're just kind of lying through, through misleading facts. And that stinks, but that's what I think we consistently see. And again, I think the regulated utilities need to be more assertive, is because we always make sure we're accurate. And there's a lot of time and effort put into making sure that what Brad and I put out, and Power for Tomorrow puts out, and our clients put out is accurate. And on the retail supplier side, it's sort of the opposite side of the same coin. Everything they're putting out is intending to mislead and confuse journalists and reporters, and throw them off the scent about what's really going on, which is, at the end of the day, it's low income customers paying more for electricity. And why in the world would you think that's good public policy?
Thank you for that, Gary. Okay, our final question for all of our guests is always, if you had all the power in the industry, what would you do with it?
I would re-regulate for sure. That would be my move. I think we're in this moment right now where we need a bunch of power and we need it quick. And we need to figure out how to utilize all resources, whether it's like wind, solar, natural gas, nuclear, and you need a plan to do it. And you don't have that planning opportunity with deregulation. It's like a national imperative.
And the only thing I would add is I agree with all that, and I wish we could depoliticize this issue, because I think when politics get involved from either side, we make bad decisions, or we prioritize the wrong things. And the goal should be reliable and affordable energy. And if that's the goal, I think all of our problems are easily solvable if we politicize these issues, right or left. We're making it harder to achieve those goals. So that would be my hope, is that we can leave politics at the side when we're talking about these types of issues. And I think having enough energy is it's just the new gold rush, and we cannot afford to lose the AI revolution, or because we don't have enough electricity. It's just our global competitors are nipping at our heels. And while this country's not perfect, and I have my qualms with Google and Amazon and all these companies, our adversaries are infinitely worse, that are trying to take over this technology, and we need to win. And that means I think depoliticizing the issues to ensure we have reliable and affordable electricity in every state.
Interesting. Thank you, Gary. I appreciate both of your responses, and I truly appreciate both of you for joining us today. I enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks so much for
Yeah.
having us and for reaching out. This was great.
Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. Please support our work. You can subscribe to the Electric Wire podcast if you haven't already, and you can follow us on Twitter at The Electric Wire. Thanks also to the members of the Customers First Coalition for supporting this podcast. Our members are Dairyland Power Cooperative, Madison Gas and Electric, the Municipal Electric Utilities of Wisconsin, WPPI Energy, the Citizens Utility Board, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 2150, and the Wisconsin Electric Cooperatives Association. Thanks again for listening. We'll have a new episode next month.